Hi, I'm Tim Mills and welcome to Say 86 podcast. Today we're going to talk about the business of hospitality and particularly the lessons they never teach you. So let me start by asking you a question. Why would anyone actually open a restaurant? It's a serious question because if you believe everything you read in the newspapers or hear on the television, it would seem like one of the last businesses you choose to invest in. Every week there's another story about rising food costs, increasing wages, higher energy prices, labor shortages, or another long-established restaurant quietly closing its doors. Every hospitality conference seems to have another panel discussing shrinking margins, recruitment challenges, or changing customer behavior. And if you listen to all of what was said without ever stepping inside a restaurant, you'd probably conclude the industry was in terminal decline. And yet, despite all those headlines, restaurants continue to open. New cafes appear on high streets every month. Young chefs still dream about having a place they can call their own. Families continue investing their savings into a neighborhood restaurants because they believe they can create something special. Independent operators continue taking risks that on paper may seem very little sense at all. Investors continue backing hospitality concepts, and customers continue filling dining rooms every Friday and Saturday night. So why? Why would anyone willingly enter an industry that demands long hours, relentless commitment, and more resilience than almost any other business I can think of? The answer, I believe, is remarkably simple. Hospitality isn't a logical industry, it's an emotional one. That's probably the first lesson nobody teaches you. Nobody falls in love with hospitality because they enjoy stock takes or payroll. Nobody decides to become a restaurateur because they can't wait to negotiate waste collection contracts or compare electricity prices. Those things become part of the job, of course, but they aren't actually what attracts people in the first place. People fall in love with hospitality because they love seeing people enjoy themselves. They love creating an atmosphere where conversations happen naturally. They love watching families celebrate birthdays, friends reconnecting after years apart, and couples celebrating milestones they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Hospitality gives us the opportunity to become one of the moments that matter, even if we're only involved for a couple of hours. I've spent my entire life around this industry, and I still find that remarkable. Hospitality has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I grew up surrounded by restaurants, operators, suppliers, and people who genuinely cared about creating memorable experiences. And at the time, I thought that was perfectly normal. Looking back now, I realize I was incredibly fortunate because I learned lessons that never appeared in a textbook. I learned that reputation takes years to build and minutes to lose. Most importantly, I learned that people always remember how you made them feel, even if they can't remember exactly what they ordered. Like many people who build careers in hospitality, I didn't begin in a management office or a boardroom. I started on the restaurant floor as a waiter, and I'm grateful that I did because waiting tables teaches you things that are almost impossible to learn elsewhere. At first, you think the job is about carrying plates, remembering orders, and making sure drinks arrive on time. Before long, however, you begin to realize that none of those things are actually part of the real job. The real job is paying attention. It's noticing that a couple have gone unusually quiet because something isn't right with the meal they ordered. It's noticing that a couple have gone unusually quiet because something isn't right with the meal before they feel the need to complain. It's recognizing that a regular customer has had a difficult day and probably doesn't want the same cheerful conversation you may normally have. It's understanding that the family with two young children isn't looking for a 3-hour dining experience. They're looking for efficiency, kindness, and a little understanding because one of the children is already becoming restless. Hospitality rewards people who notice these things. Now, that might sound obvious, but it's not. The best waiter I've ever worked with wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the loudest, and he certainly wasn't the most theoretical. What made him exceptional was his ability to observe. He seemed to know what people needed before they even asked. Glasses were filled without interruption, extra napkins before they became necessary. Children received coloring pencils before parents had the chance to wonder how they were going to keep them occupied. Watching him work was like watching someone conduct an orchestra. Everything appeared effortless. Yet behind that effortless performance was extraordinary attention to detail. I've thought about him many times over the years because he taught me something that has shaped my entire view of hospitality. Service is what we do. Hospitality is how you make people feel. Those are two completely different things. And a business owner can deliver technically excellent service and still leave customers emotionally cold. Equally, I visited modest cafes where the coffee was good rather than extraordinary, yet I'd happily return every week because the people made me feel so welcome. They remembered my name, they asked genuine questions, and they created an atmosphere that felt comfortable rather than transactional. That's incredibly powerful because it changes the way you think about the business. If hospitality is fundamentally about making people feel welcome, then every decision should support that objective. The menu matters because it contributes to the experience, of course. The interior design matters because it influences how people feel when they walk through the door. Music matters, lighting matters, cleanliness matters, technology matters, even procurement matters, marketing matters. They all matter because they either help or hinder the experience you're trying to create. What they should never become is the experience itself. Sometimes I think we've made hospitality more complicated than it needs to be. We talk effortlessly about trends, concepts, and innovation. And while all those things have their place, the business that stay with us are usually much more simple. They're the places where people feel welcome. They're the places where someone remembers us. They're the places we recommend to friends without hesitation because we trust them to deliver a consistently enjoyable experience. Trust is a fascinating word in hospitality because customers rarely use it, yet it's exactly what they're describing. When someone says, let's go there, we know it'll be good. What they're really saying is, I trust them. That trust isn't built through advertising. It isn't built through discounts. It isn't built through one exceptional meal. It's built gradually, visit after visit, interaction after interaction, until your business becomes part of someone's routine rather than simply another option. That, in my opinion, is when a hospitality business becomes truly valuable. Now, not when it's full on a Saturday night, not when it wins awards, not when it appears in a magazine. When people begin recommending it, it's because they trust in it enough to attach their own reputation to it. So think about that for a moment. Every recommendation a customer makes is a reflection of their confidence in your business. They're effectively saying to a friend, I believe you'll enjoy this because I trust these people to look after you. And that's an extraordinary compliment, and it's one that can never be taken for granted. Perhaps that's why I always believe that hospitality isn't really about food. Now, food is incredibly important, of course. Poor food will eventually undermine even the best service. But outstanding food without genuine hospitality is like listening to a technically brilliant musician who never connects emotionally with the audience. You admire the skill, but you don't necessarily remember the performance. The restaurants we remember are the ones where everything comes together. The food, the service, the atmosphere, the people, and the feeling all align to create something greater than the sum of their parts. That doesn't happen by accident, of course. It happens because somebody somewhere behind the scenes has thought deeply about every detail and understood that the business they're building isn't simply a restaurant. It's a place where memories are made. That may sound like an overly romantic way of describing a restaurant, but I genuinely believe it is. Think about the places you've returned to throughout your life. You probably don't remember every dish you ordered or every bottle of wine you shared, but I suspect you remember who you were with there. You remember celebrating a promotion, introducing your parents to your partner for the first time, taking your children out after they passed an important exam, or sitting opposite someone as they nervously accept a marriage proposal. Restaurants quietly become part of the backdrop to people's lives, and with that comes an enormous responsibility. Every service is another opportunity to contribute to someone's story, even if they never knew your name. It's easy to forget that when you're standing in the middle of a busy Friday evening service, at that moment you're thinking about tickets piling up in the kitchen, a delivery that arrived late that morning, a member of staff who phoned in sick, and a customer at a table 12 who wants to know whether the risotto can be made without parmesan. Hospitality is an extraordinary ability to fill your head with immediate problems, and that's understandable because the business demands your attention every minute of the day. The challenge for every owner is making sure those immediate problems never distract you from the bigger purpose of the business. I've lost count of the number of times I've spoken with operators who've become so consumed by running their restaurant that they've forgotten why they opened it in the first place. Their days become dominated by rosters, invoices, maintenance, recruitment, supplier negotiations, utility costs, and endless administration. None of those things are operational. None of those things are optional. They're all part of building a successful business. The danger is that over time they can slowly replace the sense of excitement that inspired the business in the very first place. Every now and then, I encourage owners to spend an hour sitting quietly in their own restaurant, not as a customer, but as an observer. Leave the office, put the phone down, watch customers arrive, listen to their conversations, notice how your team greet people. Pay attention to what happens when food reaches the table. Observe the little moments that normally pass by unnoticed because you're too busy dealing with something else. It's remarkable what you discover when you give yourself permission to simply watch. You'll notice things that never tell a story. You'll notice things that reports never tell you. You'll notice a member of staff instinctively helping a colleague without being asked. You'll see a customer smile because someone remembered their name. You'll realize that one table always seems to receive their meal slightly later than everyone else because of the way the kitchen workflow operates. And you'll notice that guests consistently gather near the entrance because they're unsure whether they should wait to be seated. None of these observations appear in your financial statements, yet each one tells you something important about the business. The longer I've spent in hospitality, the more convinced I've become that curiosity is one of the most valuable qualities an operator can possess. Curiosity keeps businesses moving forward because curious people ask better questions. They don't assume they already know why customers behave the way they do. They ask. They don't assume they understand every decision that's been made. They explain. They don't assume a supplier is simply there to deliver products. They build relationships, ask for advice, and recognize that the people supporting their business often possess insights that can make the operation even stronger. One of the great privileges of working with Say86 is that I have conversations every week with operators facing completely different challenges. One person is trying to reduce food waste, another is preparing to open a second venue, someone else is searching for a new coffee supplier or trying to understand how artificial intelligence might help streamline administrative tasks. On the surface, those conversations seem unrelated, yet they almost always arrive at the same conclusion. Successful businesses ask questions before problems become crisis. That's a habit worth developing because hospitality has never been an industry where standing still is an option. Customer expectations evolve constantly. Technology changes at a remarkable pace. Economic conditions fluctuate. Customers' behavior shifts. What worked brilliantly 5 years ago may no longer be enough today, and what feels innovative today may become standard practice surprisingly quickly. I sometimes smile when people ask whether technology is changing hospitality, because in truth, hospitality has always evolved. Years ago, a reservation book sat beside the telephone, and someone carefully wrote every booking by hand. Then digital reservation systems arrived. Online reviews changed the way people discovered restaurants. Mobile ordering appeared. Contactless payments became normal. Artificial intelligence is now beginning to automate administrative tasks that once consumed hours of management time. Every one of these changes prompted concern from someone. Every one of them also created opportunities. Now, personally, I don't think technology will ever replace hospitality because hospitality isn't a transaction, it's a human experience. Technology can certainly remove unnecessary friction. It can help us forecast demand more accurately, communicate with customers more efficiently, and reduce administrative work. Those are valuable improvements because they allow people to spend more time doing the one thing technology still struggles to replicate, making other people feel genuinely welcome. That's an important distinction because I sometimes hear conversations suggesting that hospitality must choose between technology and personal service. I don't believe that's true at all. The best businesses must combine both. They embrace technology where it creates efficiency, but they remain relentlessly focused on the human interactions that define the guest experience. A reservation system may remember a customer's name, but it still takes a thoughtful member of the team to greet that customer warmly, ask about their family, and make them feel as though they've returned somewhere familiar. When I think back to my own journey, beginning as a waiter and eventually working across so many different parts of the industry, one thing stands out more than anything else. Every meaningful lesson I learned came from people rather than processes. It came from watching experienced operators remain calm during difficult services, from seeing managers take responsibility when things went wrong instead of looking for someone else to blame. And it came from suppliers who genuinely cared whether a restaurant succeeded because they understood that their own success was connected to the success of the business they served. That last point has become increasingly important to me because I believe hospitality is entering a new era. For too long, we've treated every part of the industry as though it exists independently. Operators negotiate with suppliers, suppliers negotiate with manufacturers, technology companies build software, consultants provide advice. Everyone works incredibly hard, but often in parallel rather than together. And I think that's changing. I think it's one of the most encouraging developments I've seen during my career. Hospitality works best when it behaves like a community rather than a collection of individual businesses. When knowledge is shared, everyone improves. When operators openly discuss challenges, others avoid making the same mistakes. When suppliers become trusted advisors instead of simply salespeople, relationships become stronger. When technology companies genuinely understand the operational realities of a busy restaurant, they create better solutions. Collaboration has always existed informally in hospitality, but today we have an opportunity to strengthen it in ways that simply weren't possible before. That's one of the reasons I remain so optimistic about the future. Yet the challenges are real, and we should never minimize them. Costs will continue to rise, and consumer expectations will continue evolving. But the industry has also become more connected, more informed, and more willing to learn from one another than at any other point I can remember. Those are powerful advantages, particularly for independent businesses that may once have felt isolated. That's not as exciting as the myths we sometimes tell ourselves, but I think it's far more encouraging. It means success isn't reserved for the lucky few, it's available to operators who remain disciplined, curious, and committed to improving a very little each day. Experience is a funny thing because they rarely happen by accident. When people leave a restaurant and they say, "That was fantastic," they're usually talking about the evening as a whole. They might mention the food first, because that's the obvious thing to talk about. But if you ask another couple of questions, something interesting happens. They tell you the waiter was brilliant. They tell you the owner came over for a chat. They tell you they never felt rushed, even though the restaurant was busy. They tell you the atmosphere was amazing, or the music was just right, or the wine recommendation was spot on. What they're describing isn't one moment, they're describing hundreds of little moments that all come together. And that is hospitality. It's the accumulation of small things done consistently well. I've always believed that customers don't judge restaurants the way owners judge restaurants. Owners notice the things that went wrong. The customer never received the bread they ordered. Table 6 had to wait an extra 5 minutes for dessert because the kitchen was under pressure. The wrong bottle of wine was delivered to the table before being corrected. As owners, we replay those moments in our heads because we know they could have been better. The customer, on the other hand, often remembers something completely different. They remember laughing with friends, remembering that someone genuinely cared. They remember feeling comfortable. It's a good reminder that perfection isn't actually the objective, it's consistency. And I think one of the biggest lessons this industry has taught me. Perfection is impossible because hospitality is delivered by people, and people do make mistakes. We all do. Glasses get dropped, orders occasionally get mixed up, deliveries don't arrive, equipment decides to stop working at exactly the wrong moment. Even if you've been in hospitality for more than about 5 minutes, you'll know that no two services are ever the same. And to be honest with you, that's what I actually love about the industry. The difference between good businesses and great businesses isn't that great businesses avoid problems, is that they recover from them brilliantly. I've seen restaurants completely rescue what should have been a disastrous evening simply because the team owned the project. Nobody argued, nobody blamed someone else. They apologized, fixed it, and moved on. And customers definitely remember that. In fact, I'd argue that some of the strongest customer relationships are built after something goes wrong. That probably does sound strange. Surely the best experience is one where nothing has ever gone wrong. Of course it is. But life doesn't work like that, and businesses don't work like that, and people certainly don't work like that. What customers really want is confidence that if something does go wrong, they'll be looked after. And that's where leadership starts. People often think leadership is about standing at the front of the restaurant giving instructions, and I don't think it is. I think leadership is about behavior. It's about setting the standard without constantly talking about the standard. It's about arriving before everyone else because you've asked your team to be punctual. It's about speaking respectfully under pressure because you've asked your team to treat one another with respect. It's about staying calm when everything around you feels chaotic because your team will always mirror your behavior. Now, I've watched enough services over the years to know that emotions spread through restaurants remarkably quickly. If the owner is stressed, everyone feels it. If the head chef is angry, the kitchen tightens up. If the restaurant manager starts panicking, suddenly everyone mirrors the issue, feeling like it's a major crisis. The opposite is actually true as well. Calm spreads, confidence spreads, optimism spreads. That's why I believe leadership has very little to do with authority and everything to do with influence. Your team are always watching you, even when you don't think they are. They're watching how you respond to difficult customers, how you speak to suppliers. They're watching whether you thank the kitchen after a busy service. Those little moments quietly define the culture of your business. Culture is another one of those words that gets used so often, it's almost lost its meaning. But let me tell you one thing, how I feel about it. Culture is about what people do when you're not standing beside them. You can write values on the wall, put them in an employee handbook. You can print them off on coffee cups if you like. None of that creates culture. Culture is created by behavior repeated every single day. If a new employee joins your restaurant and sees experienced staff helping each other without being asked, that becomes normal. If they see managers thanking people at the end of a shift, that becomes normal. If they see someone making a mistake and being coached instead of humiliated, that becomes normal too. Before long, nobody even talks about culture because they're simply living it. I've met operators who tell me they can't afford good staff. I understand the frustration because recruitment has become harder, but I usually ask another question. What happens after people join your business? Finding great people is only half the challenge. Keeping them is where leadership really begins. People don't usually leave because carrying plates is difficult. They leave because they don't feel appreciated. They don't feel they're learning. They don't see a future, or they stop enjoying coming to work. So think back to the best manager you've ever worked for. I guarantee it wasn't because they wrote the best roster. It was because they made you feel important. They believed in you before you believed in yourself. Every one of us can remember something like that. And we can also remember the opposite. The manager everyone hoped wasn't working that day. The person who drained the energy out of the room before service even started. Both of these people taught us something. One showed us the sort of leader we wanted to become. The other showed us exactly the opposite. And leadership in hospitality isn't complicated. It's difficult. There's a difference. The principles are actually quite simple. Treat people fairly. Communicate honestly. Hold high standards. Take responsibility. Stay curious. Never ask someone to do something you're not prepared to do yourself. Simple doesn't mean easy. It takes discipline. It takes consistency. It takes showing up every day with the same attitude, regardless of whether the restaurant is full or empty. That's what your team deserve. And ultimately, that's what your customers experience, even if they never actually realize it. One of the biggest turning points for any operator comes when they realize that being busy and being successful are not the same thing. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a restaurant on a Friday night and heard someone say, "We're absolutely flat out, we must be doing well." I always smile when I hear that because I understand why people think it. A full restaurant feels successful. The noise, the energy, the constant movement of staff, the queue at the door, it all creates the impression that the business is thriving. And sometimes it is. However, sometimes it isn't. A full restaurant can lose money just as efficiently as an empty one if the fundamentals aren't right. That surprises people when I say it, but it's absolutely true. I've sat down with operators after what they described as their busiest month ever, only to discover that their margins had quite clearly disappeared. Food costs had crept up because nobody had reviewed supplier pricing for months. Labor costs had increased because rostering had become very expensive. The menu hadn't changed despite customers' buying habits changing around it. They were working harder than ever, serving more customers than ever, and somehow making less money than they had in the last 12 months. That's exhausting, although it is avoidable. The mistake wasn't working hard. Hospitality has never been afraid of hard work. The mistake was assuming that hard work would also solve business problems, and it won't. Hard work is essential, but directions matter just as much. Imagine setting off on a journey. You can drive for 12 hours without stopping. But if you're heading in the wrong direction, all you've done is get further away from where you actually wanted to be. And business are no different. Activity doesn't always equal progress. And that's why I encourage operators to spend time away from the floor. Now, I know that sounds impossible. The first reaction I usually get is, "I'd love to, Tim, but who's going to run the restaurant?" And it's a fair question. My answer actually is another question. How are you ever going to build a business that grows if it only works when you're standing in the middle of it? That can be an uncomfortable conversation because many hospitality businesses become dependent on the owner. The owner knows every customer, solves every problem, approves every invoice, answers every phone call, and makes every important decision. It feels productive because everything passes through one person. In reality, it's one of the greatest risks a business can create. If everything depends on you, you don't actually own the business, you own a very demanding job. The businesses I admire most have owners who are deeply involved without becoming the bottleneck. They've built capable teams, established clear expectations, and created systems that allow good people to make good decisions. That doesn't mean they disappear, quite the opposite, in fact. It means they spend their time leading instead of constantly rescuing. I think that's one of the biggest differences between operators who survive and operators who build lasting businesses. They understand that leadership isn't about being the busiest person in the room, it's about creating an environment where everyone else can succeed. I remember talking to an owner who proudly told me he hadn't had a day off in nearly 3 years. He expected congratulations, although instead I asked him whether he thought that was a sign of success. He looked at me for a moment before answering. "I suppose it means people need me." "Maybe," I replied, "or maybe it means the business needs to become less dependent on you." Now, that wasn't a criticism, it was simply an observation. Hospitality has a habit of rewarding heroic behavior. We almost wear exhaustion as a badge of honor. We celebrate 16-hour shifts 7 days a week and stories about sleeping in the office because there's simply too much to do. I've lived this industry long enough to know these moments actually happen. There are periods when extraordinary effort is required, particularly during an opening or a major challenge. But they should be the exception, not the business model. Burnout doesn't really build great businesses. Healthy, engaged leaders do. And if you're permanently exhausted, your decision making suffers. You become reactive instead of thoughtful. Small problems become feeling much larger when they actually really aren't. Conversations become shorter and patience disappears. And with that, creativity fades. Eventually, the business starts reflecting the emotional state of the person leading it. And that's why I believe looking after yourself isn't separate from looking after the business. They are definitely connected. As the best operators I've met have learned how to create space to think. Sometimes that's an hour before everyone else arrives for shift. Sometimes it's a walk after service. Sometimes it's breakfast with another operator to exchange ideas and challenge each other's thinking. Whatever form it takes, they've recognized that stepping away from the immediate demands of the restaurant often allows them to make better decisions when they return. Now, I've always enjoyed these conversations because hospitality people have a unique way of speaking to one another. Within 5 minutes, you've usually moved beyond small talk and into real business problems. So, how are you managing wages these days? Have you found a good supplier for what are you doing for rostering right now? Have you seen what customers are really doing lately? It's one of the things I love most about the industry. Despite being incredibly competitive, it's also remarkably generous. Most operators are happy to share ideas because they understand something important. A strong hospitality industry benefits everyone. And that's one of the reasons actually why Say86 exists. People sometimes ask me what Say86 actually is. And while we could talk about technology, procurement, or supplier relations, I think there's a much simpler answer. We're trying to help hospitality businesses make better decisions. And in actual fact, I almost describe Say86 as a lifeline to the industry because I've been there through those tough times. And sometimes that by introducing them to trusted suppliers, sometimes by creating efficiencies through technology, sometimes it's simply by connecting people who can learn from one another. Because there's one thing I've learned after spending my life around this industry, it's that nobody succeeds alone. Every successful restaurant sits within a network of suppliers, a network of loyal customers, dedicated staff and advisors, a network of operators. The stronger those relationships become, the stronger the business becomes. And that's true whether you're running a neighborhood cafe with 6 employees or a restaurant group operating across multiple sites. Success in hospitality has never been a solo achievement, ever. It's always been a collective one. And I think that's something we don't celebrate enough in hospitality. We tend to create individuals. We celebrate the chef, the owner, the entrepreneur, the person whose name is above the door. Now, they're important, of course, but the truth is no restaurant has ever become successful because of one person alone. Every great venue is the result of hundreds of people making thousands of good decisions, many of which nobody outside the business will ever actually see. Customer doesn't see the supplier who drove across town to make an emergency delivery because of a key ingredient that didn't arrive. They don't see the kitchen porter who already had been working for hours before the first guest walks through the door. They don't see the accountant who quietly spotted a cash flow issue before it became a crisis, or the maintenance engineer who fixed a refrigeration unit at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. That's one of the reasons I've always had enormous respect for suppliers. Early in my career, I think I looked at suppliers the way many people do. They delivered products, sent invoices, and we negotiated prices. That was about the extent of our relationship. However, the longer I've been in hospitality, the more I've realized how simplistic that view was. A great supplier doesn't simply deliver stock. They always help protect your reputation. Now think about that for a moment. If a supplier consistently delivers quality produce on time, exactly as promised, they're contributing to every positive experience your guests have. If they communicate well, solve problems quickly, and tell you about potential issues before the effect they have on your business, they're no longer just supplying products, they're becoming part of your operation. And I've always believed the best supplier relationships are partnerships rather than transactions. That's why I smile when someone tells me they've changed suppliers to save a few pence on a product without considering everything else that relationship provided. Price matters, of course it does. Every operator has a responsibility to manage costs carefully, but value and price have never actually been the same thing. I've known operators who saved a small amount on purchasing, only to lose far more through inconsistency, late deliveries, or poor communication. Equally, I've seen businesses build extraordinary long-term relationships with suppliers because both sides understood they're working towards exactly the same goal. When your restaurant succeeds, your suppliers succeed, of course. When your suppliers go stronger, they often become better equipped to support your business. It's an absolute partnership, and that's very much the philosophy we've tried to build with Say86. We're not interested in simply creating another marketplace where everyone competes on price. The hospitality industry has never been short of passionate people. What we've occasionally lacked is connection, and for years operators solved the same problems independently. One cafe would spend weeks searching for a reliable supplier, while another cafe just a few streets away had already found exactly what they were looking for. It could be one restaurant would struggle while rostering, while another had discovered a brilliant solution months earlier. There was a knowledge everywhere, but very few ways of sharing it efficiently. And technology, of course, is changing that. Not because technology is replacing relationships, no, but because it's making relationships easier to build. And there's an important distinction there. I don't believe technology will ever replace a conversation over a cup of coffee. It won't replace trust built over years of working together. And it won't replace instinct, experience, or judgment. What it can do is remove unnecessary friction. It can eliminate repetitive administration. It can service better information. It can introduce people who would otherwise never have met. And that's where I think the real opportunity lies. Artificial intelligence is a good example. People ask me about AI all the time, and usually the question is whether I think it will replace jobs in hospitality. And in actual fact, I've just come off a podcast interview with somebody and we discussed AI relentlessly. And of course, the conversation was about how is it going to impact the industry moving forward in the future? Will it replace concierge, receptionists, etc.? My answer is almost always the same: no. I think it will replace tasks. And there's an important difference there. Hospitality has always been about people looking after people. And I don't believe customers will ever stop valuing genuine human interaction. What they don't particularly value is waiting unnecessarily, filling out repetitive forms, chasing invoices, or spending hours on administrative work that adds very little value. If AI can reduce those tasks, managers gain something incredibly valuable, and that's time. Imagine giving every venue manager an extra hour every day. Not an extra hour to answer emails, an extra hour to coach a young waiter, to talk with a chef about menu development, to sit with a restaurant and observe guests, and of course to meet suppliers and review numbers properly instead of rushing them. And that's where technology, I believe, creates value, not by replacing hospitality, but by giving us more time to practice it. I sometimes wonder whether that's where the future of hospitality really lies. Not in becoming more automated for the sake of automation, but in becoming more human because technology has removed some of the distractions. The operators I admire most have never been frightened by change. They're curious about it, in fact. They ask, could this make my business better? Not, how could this replace what we do? And that's an entirely different mindset. Curiosity has always been one of the greatest assets in hospitality. The day you stop learning is usually the day someone else starts overtaking you. And I still visit restaurants the same way I did years ago, not because I'm looking for faults, but because I'm looking for ideas. I notice how someone greets me. I notice the lighting, the music. I notice whether staff talk to one another respectively. I notice how long it takes before someone acknowledges a customer waiting at the door. And I'm fascinated by those little details because they reveal the thinking behind the business. Some of the best ideas I've ever seen weren't expensive. They were revolutionary. They were thoughtful. Someone deciding to write a handwritten thank you note to a regular customer, or a manager introducing every new team member personally instead of simply pointing them towards the kitchen. Perhaps a chef leaving the past to explain a new dish because they wanted guests to understand the story behind it. None of those things actually cost any money. Every one of them created value. And that's another lesson hospitality's taught me over the years. The value isn't always created by spending more money. More often it's created by paying more attention to detail and people, attention to the experience you're creating every single day. And when you combine that attention with good leadership, disciplined financial management, strong supplier relationships, and a team that genuinely enjoys looking after people, something quite remarkable happens. Your restaurant stops competing on price. It starts competing on trust. And trust, in my experience, is one of the few competitive advantages that never go out of fashion. Trust is an interesting way of changing the conversation because once people trust your business, they stop asking whether they should visit and start asking when they can come back. They recommend you without being prompted because they're confident the experience they've enjoyed is the same experience their friends and family will receive. And that's an incredibly powerful position to be in because you've moved beyond attracting customers and started building actual advocates. And I've often thought that's the point where hospitality becomes more than a business. It becomes part of the fabric of a community. Think about your own town or city for a moment. Every place has those venues that seem to have always been there. The cafe where 3 generations of the same family have had breakfast. The local pub where birthdays, retirements, and Christmas lunches have been celebrated for years. Or the neighborhood restaurant where the staff have watched children grow up, leave for university, and eventually return with their own families. Those businesses don't become institutions because they have the trendiest menu or the most expensive fit out. They become institutions because they've earned something far more valuable than attention. They've earned loyalty. Loyalty isn't created through loyalty cards, points, or discounts. Those things can certainly encourage repeat visits, but genuine loyalty is emotional rather than transactional. It exists because people feel a real connection with the business. They know the people behind it, the standards. They feel comfortable walking through the door. In many ways, the restaurant becomes familiar, and familiarity is something people value far more than we often appreciate. That's one of the reasons I sometimes smile when operators tell me they're worried about the latest hospitality trend. Every year, there seems to be another prediction about what customers supposedly want. One year it's a QR code ordering, the next it's robot servers, then it's virtual brands, ghost kitchens, or some new social platform that apparently is going to transform the industry overnight. Now, don't misunderstand me. Trends matter because they often reflect changing customer behavior, and ignoring change is never a sensible strategy. But trends should never distract us from the fundamentals. People still want to feel welcome. They still appreciate genuine warmth and value consistency. They still remember kindness. And those things haven't changed in decades, and I don't believe they'll change in the decades ahead. What changes is the way we support experiences. That's where innovation belongs. And innovation should make hospitality easier to deliver, not more complicated. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see businesses make is introducing technology because everyone else is doing it, rather than because it genuinely solves a problem. Before adapting any new system, I think it's worth asking a very simple question. How will this improve the experience for my guests or my team? If the answer isn't immediately obvious, perhaps it's the wrong investment. I've always believed technology should remove friction rather than create it. If it saves your team time, improves communication, reduces errors, or gives managers better information, it's probably adding value. However, if it creates more screens, more passwords, and more complexity without delivering meaningful benefits, then it's probably worth questioning whether it's really helping at all. And I think the same principle applies to almost every decision in hospitality. Before adding another menu item, ask whether it genuinely improves the guest experience or simply makes the kitchen more complicated. Before extending opening hours, ask whether you're creating a profitable business or simply increasing costs. Perhaps before introducing another promotion, ask whether you're attracting the kind of customers who will return or simply encouraging one-off bargain hunters. Every decision has consequences, and the best operators understand that growth isn't about saying yes to opportunity. Often it's about having the confidence to actually say no. That confidence usually comes with experience. When you're opening your first restaurant, it's incredibly tempting to try to appeal to everyone. You don't want to turn customers away, so the menu becomes bigger. You stay open longer. You try to cater for every possible dietary preference, every demographic, every occasion. It feels like the sensible thing to do because customers should mean more business. The reality, though, is often the opposite. The restaurants people remember usually stand for something. They're known for exceptional seafood or a famous breakfast. They're the place everyone recommends steak and pasta for or Sunday lunch. They've become recognized because they were willing to be clear about who they were instead of trying to become everything to everyone. And that's a lesson that extends well beyond restaurants, of course. Businesses become stronger when they're clear about their purpose. And one of the things we've tried to do with C86 is remain clear about ours. We exist to strengthen the hospitality ecosystem by connecting operators, suppliers, and technology in ways that create better outcomes for everyone involved. And that clarity makes decision-making much easier because every opportunity can be measured against the same question. Does this genuinely help hospitality businesses succeed? If the answer is yes, we're interested. If the answer is no, then no matter how attractive it may appear in the short term, it's probably not the right decision. And I think every business benefits from that kind of clarity. Purpose becomes a filter. It helps you decide where to invest your time, your energy, and your resources. And without it, businesses have a habit of drifting. They become reactive rather than intentional, responding to every opportunity without stopping to consider whether it aligns with the business they're trying to build. Hospitality is demanding enough without adding unnecessary complexity. And that's a lesson I've learned over the years. Simple is often much harder than complicated. Creating a short menu that executes brilliantly is harder than writing a long one. Building systems that everyone understands is harder than creating endless procedures nobody reads. And leading with clarity is often harder than constantly changing direction. Yet the businesses that master simplicity often become the businesses people admire the most. They make excellence look effortless. Of course, anyone who spent time in hospitality knows effortless is usually the result of extraordinary amount of work taking place behind the scenes. Every smooth service has been rehearsed in countless small ways. Every confident member of staff has been trained, coached, and encouraged. Every reliable supplier relationship has been built over months or years of trust. And successful businesses quietly overcome challenges that most customers will never know existed. Perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Guests don't come to restaurants to watch owners solve operational problems. They come because they want to relax, celebrate, reconnect, or simply enjoy a meal with people they care about. And it's our responsibility to make that feel effortless, even when we know just how much work has gone into creating it and how much is going on behind the scenes. And for me, that's always been the magic of hospitality. It's one of the few industries where success is measured not only by financial performance, but by the memories people carry away with them. If you've ever had someone return years later and tell you they've celebrated an engagement in your restaurant, held a retirement dinner in your private room, or brought their children back because they remembered visiting as kids, you'll understand exactly what I mean. At that point, you're no longer just running a restaurant. You've become part of people's lives. And in my view, there aren't many businesses that can honestly say that. I'd like to take you back to one of my earliest memories of working on the restaurant floor, because looking back on it now, I think it explains almost everything I've come to believe about hospitality. When you're young, you think the job is obvious. You assume people come to a restaurant because they're hungry. It seems like a perfectly reasonable conclusion. They order food, you bring it to the table, they eat it, they pay the bill, and they leave. Job done. It didn't take me long, however, to realize that I'd completely misunderstood what was happening. I remember waiting on a table one evening where three generations of the same family had come together to celebrate a birthday. Grandparents were there, the parents were there, the children were there, and like every family gathering, there was a mixture of conversations all happening at once. The children couldn't decide what they wanted to eat, the grandfather was telling a story that he'd probably told 100 times before, and everybody else was politely pretending they were hearing it for the first time. From my perspective, it was just another table in another service. To them, it was a memory. And that distinction has stayed with me ever since because it completely changed the way I thought about the job. I wasn't carrying plates. I wasn't creating an occasion. That might sound like a small difference, but it changes everything. When you start to look at hospitality through that lens, your priorities become very different. Suddenly, being 30 seconds late with a drink isn't just about a drink, it's about interrupting someone's experience. Forgetting to acknowledge people when they arrive isn't simply poor service. It's the first impression they'll carry with them for the rest of the evening. You begin to understand that every transaction either adds to the experience or quietly takes something away. And that's why I still believe hospitality is one of the most human businesses in the world. People often ask me what the biggest change has been during my career. They expect me to talk about technology, online bookings, delivery platforms, or maybe artificial intelligence. Those things have certainly changed the industry, but I don't think they've changed hospitality. People still want exactly what they've always wanted. They want to feel welcome. They want to feel valued. They want to spend time with people they care about in an environment where someone else has done all the hard work for them. Everything else is simply the mechanism that allows us to deliver that feeling. That's one of the reasons I sometimes smile when I hear operators obsessing over the latest trend. I've lost count of the number of times someone has asked me, "So, Tim, what do you think the next thing in hospitality is going to be?" And my answer usually disappoints them. I think the next big thing is exactly the same as the last big thing, and that's looking after people. The tools will change, the technology is going to improve. Artificial intelligence will automate more administrative work. Procurement platforms like C86 will continue making it easier for operators to find trusted suppliers and make better commercial sense. Customers will expect faster communication and greater convenience because that's the direction every industry is moving in. But none of those things replace the feeling a guest gets when someone genuinely cares that they've chosen to spend that evening with you. That's still the competitive advantage, I think. And in actual fact, it always has been and actually always will be, I think. One of the biggest misconceptions about hospitality is that customers are incredibly demanding. And I actually don't believe they are. I think customers are incredibly observant. There's a difference because most people don't expect perfection. They understand that restaurants are run by people and people occasionally make mistakes. However, what they do notice is attitude. They notice whether someone genuinely wants to help and they notice whether a problem is owned or avoided. I've seen businesses recover from spectacular mistakes because the response was honest, generous, and authentic. And I've also seen tiny issues become major problems because nobody took ownership. That taught me another lesson very early on. You can't always control what happens. You can always control how you respond. And I think that's true well beyond hospitality. It's true in leadership. It's true in business. It's true in life. There will always be circumstances outside your control. Maybe the markets change, the costs increase, or competitors appear, staff leaving, equipment fails. If your success depends on none of those things ever happening, you're building on a very fragile foundation. Instead, build a business that knows how to respond, build teams that communicate, and relationships with suppliers who answer the phone when things go wrong. Build systems that support people instead of restricting them, and a culture where solving problems is everyone's responsibility, not just the manager's. I think when you do that, something remarkable happens because the business becomes resilient, not because difficult things stop happening, but because you've created an organization capable of dealing with them. I think resilience is one of the least understood words in business because people often imagine resilience means never feeling stressed or never doubting yourself. That isn't resilience. Resilience is turning up the next morning after a difficult day and deciding to do it all over again, only a little better than yesterday. Every great operator I've met has had difficult problems. Of course, we all have, every single one of us. The difference is they don't allow one bad week to become a bad year. They've learned and adapted and have kept moving on. And that's why whenever someone asks me whether they should open a restaurant, I never answer immediately. Instead, I ask them one final question. If everything becomes harder than you expected, would you still want to do it? Because if the answer is yes, then perhaps hospitality has already found them. And if hospitality has found you, you'll understand something that those outside the industry don't. The business has an extraordinary habit of giving back far more than it takes. Not always financially, of course, and not necessarily immediately, but through the people you'll meet, the friendships you'll build, the communities you'll become part of, and the privilege of playing a small role in some of the happiest moments of people's lives. And for me, that's always been the real return on investment. The balance sheet matters: cash flow, leadership, operations, etc. Every one of those things deserves attention because they're what keep the doors open. But the reason most of us stay in hospitality for a lifetime has very little to do with spreadsheets. We stay because every now and then someone walks out of the restaurant smiling, turns backwards towards the team and says, "We'll definitely be back." And after all these years, I still think that's one of the best compliments a hospitality business can ever receive. One of the things I've realized over the years is that there are two completely different businesses operating inside every restaurant. There's the restaurant business the customer sees, and there's the business the owner lives. The customer sees a warm welcome, a menu, good food, music, conversation, and a couple of enjoyable hours with family or friends. If everything goes well, they'll leave thinking it looked effortless. The owner knows it was anything but. The owner knows someone called in sick an hour before. They know the delivery that should have arrived at 11 o'clock still hasn't. They know the dishwasher decided tonight was the perfect night to stop working. They know the chef had to rewrite part of the menu because a key ingredient wasn't available. I mean, there's so much I could go on forever. What about the booking system that went offline for 20 minutes? And they know none of the guests should ever become aware of it. And that is hospitality. It's solving problems before people ever realize existed. And I sometimes compare it to watching a swan on a lake. This is kind of strange, but from the surface, it looks calm, graceful, and completely in control. And of course, under the water, its legs are working incredibly hard. And restaurants, I think, are exactly the same. The best ones make difficult things look easy. That's why I've always had enormous respect for operators, because people often see the finished product, but rarely appreciate the responsibility that sits behind it. When you own a restaurant, you don't just own a business. You're responsible for livelihoods. You're responsible for the young apprentice, perhaps, who's just started his career or her career. You're responsible for the single parent relying on the roster and the suppliers waiting to be paid. I mean, the list goes on. There's landlords, customers, contractors, everyone that's connected to the business. And that's a huge responsibility. And yet, despite carrying all of that, most operators still find time to stop at a table and ask a customer how their meal is. And I've always admired that because it tells me something about the people this industry attracts. Hospitality attracts optimists. It simply has to. And if you weren't optimistic, you'd never open the doors each morning believing today is going to be another good day. Entrepreneurs are naturally optimistic people, and hospitality entrepreneurs take that optimism to another level. They invest enormous amounts of money, time, emotion into the business when nothing else is guaranteed. So think about that for a second. Most industries know exactly what they're selling before the customer arrives. Now, in hospitality, we don't. We know what we're offering, but every guest arrives with their own expectations. One table perhaps wants a quick meal, in and out before the theatre. Another is celebrating a 50th birthday. Someone else has just signed the biggest contract of their career, or a couple in the corner are probably having an argument they don't want anyone else to notice. There's perhaps a family by the window who are introducing their baby to the grandparents. Everybody walks through the same front door. Everybody wants something slightly different. And somehow we're expected to make all of them feel equally welcome. And that's an extraordinary challenge when you think about it. It's also what makes hospitality endlessly interesting. No 2 days are ever the same. No two services are ever identical. And you can have exactly the same bookings, exactly the same menu, and exactly the same team. Yet the atmosphere feels completely different. And that's because restaurants aren't machines. They're living businesses powered by people, and people are wonderfully unpredictable. That's why I laugh a little when someone tells me they finally got hospitality completely figured out. The day you think you've seen everything is usually the day something happens that you've never experienced before. And I remember talking to an operator a few years ago who'd been in hospitality longer than I had. He owned multiple venues, built successful businesses, seen recessions come and go. So we were having a coffee one morning, and I asked him what kept him interested after all these years, and he didn't hesitate. Do you know what he came out with? The people, he said. Not the food, not the money, not the expansion. It's all about the people. And then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, every morning I unlock the door and I have absolutely no idea who's going to walk in today or what conversations is going to change my week. I thought that was a brilliant answer because it's absolutely true. Hospitality constantly introduces you to people you never otherwise meet. And over the years, I've met musicians, TV film stars, builders, doctors, teachers, politicians, plumbers. I mean, the list goes on. Entrepreneurs, grandparents, it's incredible. You become part of all those stories for a little while. Very few industries can give you that privilege. And that's another reason I believe hospitality is about curiosity. You have to be interested in people. And if you're not, it becomes incredibly difficult to sustain a long career because the business is built on relationships. One of the best waiters I've ever worked alongside had an incredible memory. And it wasn't for orders, it was for people. He remembered names, he remembered where people liked to sit, he remembered birthdays. He'd remember that someone's daughter had just started university because they'd mentioned it 6 months earlier. And watching customers' face when he asked, "How's Emily settling into university?" was absolutely remarkable. People would stop, they'd smile. Sometimes they'd even ask, "How on earth did you remember that?" And the answer was simple. He listened, really listened. And that's becoming quite a rare skill now because we live in a world where everyone's in a hurry. We're thinking about the next email before we finish the current conversation. We're replying to messages while someone is talking to us. And hospitality reminds us to slow down, to pay attention, to notice. And I've often thought that restaurants are one of the last places where complete strangers willingly hand us their time. So think about that. People could eat at home, they could order delivery, they could go somewhere else. Instead, they've chosen to spend 2 hours with us, and that's an extraordinary vote of confidence. I think we sometimes forget that. We become so focused on serving food that we forget people are giving us something much more valuable than money. They're giving us their time, and time is something none of us ever get back. So that means service is absolutely essential, not because every plate has to be perfect, because every guest has chosen to spend a small part of their lives with us. I don't know about you, but I think that's a responsibility worth taking seriously. And as we come to the end of this conversation, I keep coming back to the same question we started with. Why would anyone open a restaurant? After everything we've talked about, the long hours, the financial pressure, responsibilities, people, the uncertainty, you could probably make a convincing argument that nobody should. And yet, tomorrow morning, somewhere, someone will unlock the door to a brand new cafe for the very first time. A chef will finally hang the sign outside the restaurant they've spent years dreaming about. A family will take a deep breath before welcoming their first child. Someone perhaps will make the decision to back themselves. I genuinely hope they succeed. Not just because I love hospitality, but because every successful hospitality business adds something to its community. Whether it's jobs, it's supporting local suppliers, it gives people somewhere to celebrate life's big moments and somewhere to escape for an hour when life isn't going quite to plan. Restaurants become part of people's stories. So when you stop and think about it, that's a remarkable privilege. Over the years, I've been lucky enough to see this industry from many different perspectives. I've started on the restaurant floor learning lessons that I still carry with me today. I've worked alongside operators, suppliers, and innovators. And through Say86, I now have the opportunity to speak with people across every corner of hospitality. And those conversations have reinforced something I've believed for a very long time. The businesses that last aren't always the biggest. Definitely not. They aren't always the most expensive. They aren't always the trendiest. They're the businesses that never lose sight of people. They look after their teams and build genuine partnerships with suppliers, as well as understanding their numbers without allowing spreadsheets to replace instinct. They embrace technology where it creates value, but never at the expense of human connection. And most importantly, they remember that every customer walking through the door has chosen to spend a small part of their life with them, and that deserves massive respect. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from today's conversation, it's probably this. Don't build a relationship that simply serves food. Build a business that people trust, with a team that people want to belong to, and relationships that become stronger every year. Build systems that give your people the freedom to be hospitable instead of constantly firefighting. And a culture they can be proud to walk into every morning. Because menus will change, technology will evolve, economic cycles will come and go, and consumer trends will always continue to shift. But true kindness, consistency, and great leadership will never go out of fashion. And those things have carried hospitality businesses through every challenge this industry's ever faced. And I've absolutely no doubt they'll carry us through whatever comes next. I honestly believe the future of hospitality is incredibly bright. Not because the challenge is disappearing, I mean, they're certainly not. It's bright because I've never met a more resilient, creative, or generous group of people than those who work in hospitality. Every time I visit a venue, speak with an operator, or meet a new supplier, I'm reminded that hospitality is full of people who get up every morning determined to make someone else's day a little better. And that is definitely something worth celebrating. If you're already part of this journey, thank you for what you do. I know how much work happens long before the first guest arrives and long after the last one leaves. And I know the sacrifice that families make, the commitment it takes to lead a team, and the resilience required to keep moving forward when things don't go to plan. Hospitality isn't always easy, definitely not. But it's one of the most rewarding industries I can imagine being a part of. And if you're thinking about opening your first restaurant, cafe, or bar, I hope today's conversation hasn't frightened you. Listen, I do hope that hasn't happened. I actually hope it's prepared you. Dream big, plan carefully, surround yourself with good people, ask questions, stay curious, never ever stop learning. And remember that you're not just opening a business, you're creating a place where memories will be made. So before I go, I'd like to thank you for spending time with me. There are thousands of podcasts you could listen to today, and I'm genuinely grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me. I really appreciate it. This is exactly why we created this series for Say 86. Hospitality is full of extraordinary people with extraordinary stories, and I believe we learn more by sharing those experiences than by pretending we all have the answers. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, shared it with someone in the industry, or simply told a colleague about it. The more people we can bring to this conversation, the stronger our hospitality community becomes. So until next time, keep looking after your people and, of course, keep looking after your guests and never lose sight of why you started. I'm Tim Mills. This has been The Business of Hospitality, brought to you by Say 86. And thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next episode.